Welcome to everyone on the call. Um, these are our quarterly workshops that we do with the Queen of ERISA, Bonnie Trickle, one of the nation's leading ERISA attorneys. Bonnie, when I saw the title for this one, and when we put together the docket for 2025, and I got to be honest, I did a little sneak peek. I checked out your slides in advance, and I was like, all right, what's Bonnie going to talk about today? And I was a little shocked. Secure Act since 2019 and 2022, and obviously I'm stealing a little bit of your thunder here, but there's 131 provisions. So as we've been going out for the last now 5 years talking to our clients about Secure Act, I've been confused. I mean, I'm kidding, kind of. I get the concept of Secure Act, but the point is that's a lot of provisions, 131 provisions, some mandatory, a lot provisional, optional. And there's just a lot to take in. So if there's a workshop, a fiduciary workshop that you're going to attend, and a lot of you guys get your CE credit for this, you get your certification for your fiduciary training for the year, this is the one to come to because there is a lot going on. It's obviously there's a lot of optional provisions that the record keepers are starting to kind of bring online, and there's some decisions that need to be made. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to you and let you break it down for us because there's a lot going on, and I'm always here. If anybody has any questions, or Bonnie, if you want to bounce something off me, I got a couple questions I've already teed up as we go through that I'll throw out there, but turn it over to you and kind of let you take it from there. Secure Act, here we go.
And just to clarify, Marco didn't run past me any of the questions that he teed up. So we'll see what he's going to throw at me. But it's funny. So when we plan out our fiduciary training map for the year of what we think is important for clients and our advisor clients to present to their plan sponsors, when we think about that, one of the things that I said was top of mind was Secure Act. And some of my team members were like, why? For most of you, you're thinking, why are we talking about Secure Act? Wasn't this over 2 years ago when we first started talking about this? Isn't this kind of outdated? I would almost argue that this year is the most important year to be having these conversations. And I welcome kind of feedback on why not. But as you'll see, what we're talking about in this presentation is a reminder of, hey, here were all of those things that became required versus permissive or optional, many of which, over time, one of the things I'll probably say throughout this presentation multiple times is that Secure Act, as Marco mentioned, well over 100 provisions between Secure 1 and Secure 2. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I like to describe the actual legislation as like the umbrella, but then it relied on additional guidance from the IRS and the Department of Labor to actually be able to carry out most of the things in Secure 1 and Secure 2. So over the last 2 years, that's where we've had all the additional guidance. If you look at the first 20 days of January, we had 4 or 5 different things come out from DOL and IRS, most of which were precipitated from Secure. And again, that's not because we got a Secure 3.0, although I'll talk a little bit about Secure 3.0, but it's all coming from that additional guidance, which tells you, hey, that's great that we had a provision from Secure, but you couldn't really do anything with it until we got the additional guidance from the IRS or the additional regulation that had to be proposed and then finalized. So that's why it's important, really more now than ever before, to be having this conversation that we're going to have today. And so I think today is really like level set on, hey, let's have the conversation. And then it's almost giving you, unfortunately, a set of to-do items to go back and check with, your record keeper, your TPA if you have one, or third-party administrator, probably your payroll provider. And I think sometimes we forget about our payroll providers, but making sure we've had our check-in with them. And then as Marco mentioned, I think, Two West and team does a great job of really quarterbacking that process and helping you keep all of those folks on the same page. And it's really setting that as your to-do list from there. So once again, my name is Bonnie Trikel, excited to be here. Please feel free to use that chat or Q&A function along the way, and we'll try to just get to as many of your questions in real time. So don't feel like you have to hold them to the end, because they'll be more relevant if we hit them as we go. We're going to cover just some basics of like a reminder for those of you who forgot or who really tried to forget that, what was Secure Act? Like, what is this thing that we've been talking about? We'll cover the basics of that. We'll talk about hopefully some kind of, what are the tips for making this most successful for your participants, and really for you administering the plan. And then we'll talk about really the difference between, there is a lot of noise, I think, with the optional or permissive provisions from Secure 2.0, and we'll parse that out from what is actually required of you. I think, that's the thing when you think about like in Secure 2.0, the required versus permissive provisions, there's actually not that many that are required. It's just that they're kind of a pain for those ones that are actually required. And then there's a lot of noise from all these optional ones. And then we'll talk about, we'll probably skip over most of the small business provisions, but we'll hit on a couple of things, like some things that impact the actual expansion of coverage, and a little quick hit and run on PEPs and MEPs, because I think that's important to know about. And I'll probably let Marco chime in there. And then we'll hit some action items to conclude. So thinking back, just to give you some of the historical background of this, because I think it puts some of it in perspective and also helps you to plan ahead. Unless you're planning on retiring at the end of this year, I think this will be useful for you, because good news, there's already talk of Secure 3.0, and we will probably start to see drafts of 3.0, Secure 3.0 that is, probably by the end of this year. Marco's looking at me like, oh boy. But why is that? Well, the good news is it's not like Secure 3.0 will be brand new. So one of the things you probably noticed is Secure 1.0 had about 30-ish or so provisions in it. And Secure 1.0 from 2019 really had two main purposes. The first purpose was really to expand coverage. And I think we can all kind of get the idea there, right? We need more Americans to have access to workplace retirement plans. And we get the public policy behind that. It's this idea that people are able to save more when they have access through their employer. The second main purpose was really this idea that with Secure 1.0, hey, we need to have something that accounts for dealing with longevity. And that's actually one of the things I admire about the team at Two West, is that they've really been helping clients think about this for quite some time. But for a lot of different advisory practices across the country, this is a newer phenomenon to really start thinking about the issue of longevity and how do we help people to think about their paycheck in retirement. And so it was really this kind of twofold concept in Secure Act of 2019. Well, then CARES Act and COVID came along. Everyone forgot about Secure Act. And so that kind of, really actually got brushed aside because there were just bigger issues to deal with. So then fast forward and we had Secure 2.0. And again, you really saw, I break it down into 6 main categories of provisions, but most of the things you saw with Secure 2.0, they really weren't new at all. Most of it really was the same types of themes that you saw in Secure 1.0. And this is relevant as we start to think about what will likely happen with Secure 3.0. So you don't really see things that are introduced for the first time in these big pieces of bipartisan legislation. I think that is one really cool thing about the retirement plan space, is that it really does have, by and large, bipartisan support. Is that, you see that there is both sides of the aisle, and you saw this with Secure 2.0. There were these 3 different bills, and they came together, and that's really what formed Secure 2.0. And I think you'll start to see that with, again, you're probably kind of cringing a little bit when I say Secure 3.0, because you're like, hey, we're not done even implementing Secure 2.0. But if we are foreshadowing what's going to come, it is going to be that you'll likely see a Secure 3.0, and it will have a lot of these same themes, a continuation of expansion of coverage. Again, continuing to build on this idea that we need more Americans to have access to retirement savings. It will be a continuation through ideas like there was a bill introduced this past year, which was to lower the eligibility age from 21 to 18. I think you'll see that come back up in a Secure 3.0. One that probably impacts a lot of clients of Two West is this idea of collective investment trusts expanding from 401ks to 403b plans who don't have access to CITs today. Interestingly, that was a theme of Secure 2.0, but there was a technical error that didn't quite get it done. And so we needed additional legislation to actually get that over the finish line. And it just wasn't a priority as a standalone to actually get done in Secure 2.0. I would anticipate in a Secure 3.0, again, we'll start to see that come up. So you'll see a lot of those same themes. Another thing that you'll probably see come up is with every major bill, what comes with it? We have to have a way to pay for it, right? So you will see this concept. And again, we see this and we'll talk about it today because it creates an administrative hurdle is Rothification. You will see some form of Rothification back on the table again with the Secure 3.0, because there'll have to be some way, like there'll be these gives to expand coverage. But on the other side of it, we'll have some kind of concepts related to Roth because we'll have to have a way to pay for it. So I point out kind of these major themes because if
Hey,
you're
Connie,
planning ahead, yeah,
can you break down Rothification a little bit? Because I mean, that's a term we talk about, but you know, right? And I get it. That's the way to pay for this. But can you break that down a little bit for our audience today and just say, what does that mean for them individually and for their employees when you talk about that?
yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so we use this term Rothification. There's so many different flavors of how this might come up. It's the concept of Roth versus pre-tax. So most of your retirement plans probably have, and again, we could talk a little bit more about this, but most of your retirement plans probably have a Roth option. Now, we traditionally have always seen that as like we allowed the employee to either contribute on a pre-tax or on a post-tax or Roth basis. Now, with Secure 2.0, we saw a couple of things. We saw the optional provision that just became effective this year, which was to allow for the employer portion to become Roth. Now, I have yet to see, and again, that was optional, but again, that's kind of this leading into, hey, can we get more money to be Roth money? And that will help pay for things. That was optional. I've yet to see, practically speaking, that actually come to life in most cases. Marco, you might have a different perspective, but I think with payroll and record keepers, that's just been difficult to figure out the administration. But that applies for tiny businesses and big businesses alike, because it does have some appeal to it. But where you have seen this come up is in the required side of taking catch-ups for the over 145,000. So if you have compensation over 145,000 that will be indexed, and then saying, hey, if you're going to have catch-ups, those are going to have to be Roth. So those can no longer be pre-tax. And that's just a way to basically generate income, right, for the government, saying, hey, if we're going to give all these tax credits to encourage people to have a plan, on the other side of that, we can make money by taxing the over 145,000 crowd, essentially. So because the government works in 10-year budget cycles, right? So when they're putting together these bills, that's how they're able to pay for them. Now, there's all kinds of different ways Rothification can happen. It's as extreme as saying there will be no pre-tax, retirement plan contributions, or that our limits would go from, above 20,000 to substantially lower than 20,000, that maybe all catch-ups become Roth. There's all kinds of flavors of how that could come together. What did I miss there?
Nothing at all, other than, I just wanted to draw everybody's attention that in order to get all these things through, they needed to say, yeah, but we got to generate some money now. And that's the Rothification that's going to happen. And we just don't know exactly how it's going to roll through, but I think we can all say confidently it's going to happen in some form or fashion.
Yeah, and I think now this is where I am not a tax policy expert, but I do think if you put on kind of your lobbying tax policy hat, one other thing that's going to happen this year, which is something to watch. Again, this is not where my expertise is, but most people are familiar with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That is expiring at the end of 2025. So this is some of the prior Trump administration tax policies that are expiring at the end of 2025. That means that 2025 is a big year just overall. This isn't specific to retirement plan policy, but overall, 2025 is a big year for looking at tax policy and how something's got to give. Well, anytime that happens, where's a big bucket of money to look at for tax policy? It's retirement plans. So I know there are some pretty big lobbying efforts going on to basically protect retirement plans. And that's really happening this year too. So that's again another area to be looking at what will happen from a Roth perspective. That's going to be back on the table this year. That kind of gives the high level background of, why are we having this conversation? What's coming next? And where are we going? Um, when we look at Secure 2.0 overall, another theme I'd like to point out, in addition to what we already covered, and again, this will give most of you a good laugh, is that one of the actual sections of Secure 2.0, which we will talk a little bit about today, is a section that was called Ease of Administration for Plan Sponsors. Now, I find that to be quite laughable because overall, for most of you, you probably think that this is not easy at all and actually makes your jobs much more difficult. But there are a couple of big nuggets from Secure 2.0 that were really helpful. And one of them has to do with self correction under EPCRS. So, again, we'll talk about that, and EPCRS and all those letters, not really relevant. But what is important is understanding that when it comes to making mistakes related to your retirement plan, Secure 2.0 and then some of the follow on guidance, it actually becomes easier to correct without going to the regulators. And we'll talk about that actually with some DOL final rules that came out too here in January, totally outside of Secure. But it makes it easier for you to say, hey, I messed up. I'm going to self correct. And you don't have to go and actually file with the IRS anymore. Now, largely, I think that's because we just don't have the resources for you to go and wait in line with the IRS. They don't have the resources to process that. But that's actually great news for you as a plan sponsor. And so that is something among the 92 provisions that is actually quite helpful for you to be able to, hang your hat on that, correct your errors, and move on without having to go actually raise your hand directly and file the filing fee with the IRS. So overall, that's kind of the background of Secure 2.0 and where we're headed with Secure 3.0, probably later this year and into next year. So one of the things that I like to do is also point out, how do you know what you have to think about when looking at all these different provisions? The big thing to think about is really breaking it into three main buckets. Again, why is 2025 relevant? Because a lot of these provisions have kicked in by now. And even ones that got delayed, now is the time that you've really got to be thinking about them. So, consideration number one is the effective date of the provision. Again, some of these provisions did start with the actual enactment of the law at the end of 2022, but by and large, they were on a rolling basis. And so it was 2023, 2024, 2025, and beyond. So you didn't have to have the actual implementation, like when we think about the auto enroll provision or the long-term part-time employees. That sure is a mouthful. That didn't start, you didn't have to comply until January 1st of this year. So you had time to be able to start complying. The second thing that I think about is, again, this idea of required versus permissive, or optional rather. One of the things that I want you to think about there is who makes decisions as it relates to those optional provisions versus required. On the optional provisions, most of these, as we will talk about, are actually provisions that a settler or your business owner hat is deciding. So again, if you're the CFO, for example, you likely have the ability to bind the organization. So in your business owner hat, you would make the decision to say, no, we actually don't want to add the student loan matching provision. We'll revisit that at another time. But you wouldn't do that with your fiduciary hat on. You'd be doing that with your business owner hat on. And so the couple of things, if you're kind of taking down action items, would be to decide, is this actually a like business owner or settler hat decision? Or is this something I'm doing with my fiduciary hat on? Again, why does it matter what hat I'm wearing? Fiduciary actions come with fiduciary responsibility, meaning you have to do it in the best interest of the participants, that duty of loyalty, best interest requirement. And that also has that associated liability. So you have that ERISA fiduciary liability standard. If you're doing it in the best interest of the business, on the other hand, or the organization, you don't have that heightened duty and you don't have that heightened liability. So that's why we want to separate those. You could still probably sit in the same boardroom and make those decisions. You just would want to say, hey, we're kind of concluding this part of the meeting. We're going to talk about this as our business or organization decision, and then report that back to the committee and write that in the minutes accordingly. It seems pretty technical and logistic, but it's important to just document that in your minutes accordingly. And then the last thing I would note is just kind of the applicability of provisions. Again, a lot of these provisions, they don't apply to all plan types or plan sizes. So some of them are only for small businesses, or some of them are only for, like, there's some provisions that are only applicable to 457 plans or 403B plans. So they don't apply to all plan types. So you can kind of take this big funnel and narrow it down based on, hey, is this actually required? Is this actually something that applies to my plan type? And then you can get to what is actually at the heart of what applies to you. And I would just encourage you, if your plan runs super smooth and you've got no issues, yeah, take a look at some of those optional provisions. If not, you can always add optional provisions later. Don't let the noise of the optional provisions distract you. Just get the required things down first. You can always come back and focus on those optional provisions later. One thing that's difficult is, I think, sometimes what you hear from maybe your record keeping partners is they're sending out notices that say, hey, we're now adding XYZ optional provision. Opt in here or opt out, however they're doing it. I'm guessing, if we were in a room together right now, I'd say raise your hand if you've received one of those notices, and you should all be raising your hand. I'm sure you've received them. But you get these notices and they make it seem like this is your only time to opt into this. That's not true. If it's an optional provision, you can always go back and add it later. You can go back and add it 3 years from now. So focus on those required provisions. The other thing I would just say is kind of this little note I have on the left of my screen is that point I made at the beginning that I will continue to just reinforce, is that Secure 2.0 is a framework. It really is like, what's that phrase? The devil's in the details. The DOL and the IRS guidance, that is where the good stuff is at. But that's why you really have to be like on the lookout for all that stuff that Marco and his team is sending out to you, because they're sending out this additional information and in your committee meetings you have with them, where they're saying, hey, this is what the IRS says about X or Y. And that's really what you've got to be paying attention to, because that's where you find out that there's actually a change to the overpayment guidance, or the DOL actually has now released something on, missing participants, which impacts your policy there. That's all the additional follow-up information you need. So I'll keep rolling into talking about some of the additional things you need to know from a framework perspective, but Marco, jump in if I'm missing anything or if there's any questions so far.
Good so far. No one's jumped in yet. I'm not gonna try to stick you here for a bit. You got like 3 more slides. It's coming.
Oh my, I'm nervous. I don't know what your questions are going to be.
You already have the answer. Keep going.
The mystery is real. Okay, so another really kind of tactical thing that we have to be thinking about is, I've mentioned that there's these optional provisions, and you might be hearing from your record keeper saying, hey, you might opt into this, you might opt out of that, etc. Well, one of the things that you have to be thinking about is, how is this all going to come together to impact plan document changes, right? So we originally, when Secure came out, we got a date for plan document amendments. And then we had a notice from the IRS, notice 2024-2, And don't worry, I'm going to quiz you on all these notice numbers at the end, or you can't get your CE. I'm just kidding. There's a lot of different notices over time, but 2024-02, actually, it was like a grab bag and had a lot of different things in it. And one of the things that it included was plan document amendments. So keep in mind, again, quick tip, your plan document consists of both your, unless you have an attorney drafted document, but it consists of both your base plan document plus your adoption agreement. So all of those definitions, plus that other document with all your check boxes, that together is your plan document. One of the things that you're probably doing is you've got your plan document, and then you probably have some sort of, I'm going to say, like separate administrative checklist that you're keeping, or maybe your record keeper is doing that, or TPA. But ultimately, during this period throughout the Secure Act phase, you need to be keeping track of what are you opting into, or what are you not adopting. More so, what are you opting into and what is required of you under Secure, because all of those things are going to constitute what for your plan document. Those are your amendments, right? All of these are going to form your amendments to your plan doc, which, depending on your plan type, most of you probably have a 401k plan, for example, and your general amendment deadline is going to be, or you might have a 403b plan perhaps, and you're going to have to do your plan document amendments by the end of next year, probably. So by the end of 2026, you're going to have your next cycle, and you're going to incorporate all of those amendments into that plan document amendment with all of your CARES Act updates and all of your Secure updates, plus any other updates you might have made along the way. Perhaps you just did some change because you on your own just changed eligibility or something else. All of those things need to be incorporated. And then you know that you have to do your new summary plan description at that time, and you send that out to participants, post on your website, and go about your normal procedures. But one of the things we're running into is we'll ask plan sponsors, hey, do you have a list of all of your changes that you're making under Secure Act? And they're like, no, my record keeper's keeping that for me. I think it's great if your record keeper keeps that, but ultimately that responsibility is on you to make sure you're keeping that list of plan document amendments, particularly if you move record keepers. Do not rely on someone else to keep this, because if you move record keepers, you need to make sure you have that in that transition process. That really brings me just to kind of, again, this is pretty self-explanatory, but a great opportunity to reinforce the idea that this really is a collaborative process. And the party that I think is getting left out the most is your payroll provider. I cannot reinforce enough making sure that you are checking in with your payroll provider. I'll give an example of one of the optional provisions, which is the Section 109. I'll talk about this maybe again here in a little bit, but Section 109, which is often referred to as the super catch-up provision. So the super catch-up, or what was the catch-up for ages 60 to 63, where there was just that certain window, so just 60 to 63, and don't ask why it was 60 to 63, other than that's what came out of the budget negotiations. That comes up a lot. It's like, hey, why was it only 60 to 63? But this is the special catch up where it's an additional catch up that can be made for those age 60 to 63. And it started this year. So as of this January 1st, if you opted into that, now your participants who are making catch ups can make an additional catch up to, I believe for this year, it's 11,250 would be their catch up amount for this year. And of course, that's indexed and it'll go up every year. But again, that would be an example where some payroll providers, like I believe ADP, for example, I don't think you had to make any change with them. I've got other payroll providers where you actually needed to make an update to the file to be able to specifically make a change on your file feed for that super catch up. So again, different payroll providers are handling that in different ways. You want to make sure that if you opted into that, you tested that out and did a check with both your payroll provider and your record keeper and or TPA. I don't think I'll make any other points here other than it's really a good idea to do a one-time check-in, probably in the next couple months, if you have the bandwidth, just to check in with any of your service providers that were listed on that last slide, just to do a quick check on things like, how are we continuing to think about what we can be doing to collaborate with those service providers. This next slide really just goes over a little bit more of what we were just talking about from the how do you actually implement these provisions? How do we do so from really a seamless process? And then we'll talk about some of the provisions a little bit more specifically from kind of the resource allocation perspective. I think that is a good opportunity, depending on your internal framework, to think about how can you get together with your working group internally that you may already have or have met with in the past to think about what are the things that you have to update internally. Now, if you've done some sort of outsourced servicing to some of your record keepers, depending on what your record keeper offers, or maybe you're working with a third party administrator, some of this might already entirely be done for you, and your own internal HRIS systems might not require as much updating. That being said, if you're still relying on potentially some sort of paper form or some sort of, maybe it's in your employee handbooks, something that talks about catch-up provisions or how to elect those things, or maybe it's depending on if you're doing flat dollar or percentage based, then that's when you're going to want to look at what kind of updates do you need to make to things like salary deferral election forms, any of your contribution limits monitoring, and any of those things as it relates to some of the provisions we've just talked about or that we're going to talk about in more detail here in a moment. Payroll file updates, we just talked about that a little bit, but again, that's really making sure both with your own system at your office, as well as any kind of external third-party system you might be using, that you've thought through how do those payroll file feeds work, and that you really plan ahead in time that you'll have an opportunity to make any of those updates well in advance so that you can really make the updates, test the files, and then make sure they're all working properly before you need them. If, for example, you made changes as of 1/1 and didn't have an opportunity to test, that's okay. It's not too late. You can just make sure that they're working properly now and that you make the adjustments. As we think about the plan from a self-correction standpoint, it's never too late to figure out if you've got an error and then quickly correct on it, as opposed to waiting until you go until next year and maybe you have an audit of the plan. It's better to go ahead and address that now. Again, the last point I'll make here is really about the communication side. I can't stress enough to just think about where are all the different places that you have communications to participants and or beneficiaries, but particularly your active participants or folks who are going to be onboarding with you, and making sure that your participant communications are consistent. So what's coming from the record keeper direct to a participant, and or what may be coming directly from your organization to a participant, what's on a website that a participant can see. I know some people will put their benefits and describe them directly on their intranet or even on a website, and then what's going into the actual plan document that's going to feed into an SPD that's going to be handed out to a participant along with enrollment materials and other things. Again, there's a real communication effort, and this is a great opportunity to review all of those communications and make sure you have your internal procedures really all aligned accordingly. I'll pause there. Marco, what did I miss?
I'm waiting for the optional update for 2025.
Oh, you're holding off on a long list there. Okay. I was waiting for the stump me moment. Again, if anyone has any questions, let me know. I think, one of the things we really want to reinforce here is more of the practical side of things. I attend a lot of webinars that'll just kind of go over all this technical stuff, but they really skim over the basics of, it's important to get on the phone with your payroll provider, ask them how they're handling it, and put them on the phone with your record keeper and make sure they actually coordinate with one another. So one of the things we wanted to do is focus on, for this webinar specifically, what is new for 2025 that is becoming mandatory. The first one I'll note is automatic enrollment and auto escalation. I'm not going to spend much time on this one because this is for new plans that are being set up. So if you already have a plan, which I believe, unless Marco corrects me, I believe everyone on the line already has a plan. So I bring this up really for two reasons. One, it's only, people see this and think, oh, I'm going to have to add auto enroll. You do not have to add auto enroll. This is for new plans going forward. Now, if you were an organization and you're going to start a sister company and add a plan, you should be mindful of it, but this is only for new plans. I do anticipate that in the future, in a Secure 3.0, it is the type of thing that has been tossed around as, hey, they will likely add some kind of auto enroll provision in a Secure 3.0 or some kind of future legislation because they feel like all plans should have it. But that is not, absolutely is not the law today. The next provision, oh,
Bonnie,
Marco, did you have?
yeah, just on that one point, fast forward 10 years. Okay.
Mhm.
Because I think that point, while you're correct, I don't think there's anybody on this call that's starting a new plan. Everybody has an established plan. However, so everybody just kind of brushes over that. But the way I would encourage every plan sponsor to kind of digest that is that 10 years from now, that new plan that was established 10 years ago is now the $10 million plan with, 500 employees or 300 employees, and they're a competitor of yours, right? And
Mhm.
now you're seeing employees go back and forth. And it's the same thing if we have time at the end when we talk about PEPs. I have a very similar philosophy in that you got to be looking towards the future because the employee of the future will be used to, "Well, I got automatic enrollment. I have auto escalation. It just is." And so now all of a sudden they go to their new job and they go to an established company that didn't have to put these provisions in place. And they may ask, why isn't your plan as competitive as that other plan that I was just in? I was automatically enrolled. I was taken care of. I was automatically escalated. So I get it that a lot of current plans are, some are electing this, some are not, right? They all have their own reasons. But I think as you fast forward down the road, as this becomes the norm, because they're going to make all plans do it, then the future is going to be that's what the employee is going to come to expect. So again, that's looking down the road quite a bit, but I think the government's kind of laying the Yellow Brick Road out for us a little bit. That's where they want to see this go.
I couldn't agree with you more. And that's why I still raise it on calls like this, where I know it's established plans, because I think there is this mindfulness toward that's where we're headed, is that they want it to be auto enroll with auto escalate. That's definitely where things are going. Yep, that's a great point. Um, and along those same lines is this similar concept, right, of expanding coverage. So there's this notion, and we saw this again building on themes from Secure 1 to Secure 2, is this idea of under Section 125, the long-term part-time employees. So what we're talking about here is not related to people getting your match, but folks making their own contribution. So this is the idea of we want people to be able to be eligible to put in their own money if, and again, it went from 3 years with Secure 1 to 2 years with Secure 2. And so the idea is that with Secure 2, we went from 3 years in one to if someone is working for 2 consecutive years, 500 hours or more, so taking it from 1,000 hour threshold to a 500 hour threshold, 500 hours or more, 2 consecutive years, then they're going to be eligible to participate in your plan. And so that started as of this year. You've got to be eligible. They've got to be eligible to participate in the plan, contributing their own money. So this is a big kind of call to action on making sure, one, you have an ability to track hours, or that you've looked at your system for tracking hours or using equivalency methods, however you're doing that, or that you're just letting everyone participate. But then again, making sure you know how to do the notices. And so that that is really working from a notice perspective out to folks. This can be a big issue in the 403B space and some of the schools that I've dealt with before, with some folks who there's no sense of being able to track for like adjuncts and that kind of thing. So again, this is a big deal for a lot of institutions and organizations who have restaurants, for example, another place where this can become a big deal because we've got a lot of transient folks in and out. If this is something that's difficult for you, definitely follow up. The IRS did create follow-up guidance to this. So we had it for both 401ks that came out in 2023, and then there was a little bit of additional follow-on guidance that came out in 2024. So certainly something we can dig into as a follow-up. I would also clarify that the long-term part-time employee piece is for all plans. So I apologize for any confusion there. This is not just for new plans. This is for all plans. So this was probably one of the bigger administrative hurdles for plans because they had to revisit and look at this, and this applies to all plans. The next piece that I'll mention is under section 303. So this was the retirement lost and found database. And in some respects, this is like a total nothing burger for some of you, but it actually is something to be mindful of. And I'll mention it for a couple of reasons. So what the Department of Labor launched literally right before the end of the year, and I would say it's probably got to work out a few little bugs, but you actually can go online, and we can share that as kind of a follow-up link if you want, or I don't know if anyone's tried it yet, but you as an individual can go online, sign up, put in like your driver's license and your social security number, and it's tied through Social Security Administration data. And so that's how the DOL, in conjunction with the Social Security Administration, is tracking this. But it is a database, and it is tracking when someone leaves an employer. That's how they're going to be able to track you going from one place to another. And so it is a lost and found database. Why does this matter to you? This matters to you in conjunction with a couple of other Secure 2.0 provisions, as well as a couple of other things that are important related to your fiduciary duty. Number one, you as an employer have a duty related to missing participants. A few years back, the Department of Labor issued missing participant guidance. It was something you are required to follow, despite the fact that that guidance was a little bit wacky in nature. Then the department had some follow-up guidance, and we can send you kind of an update on this, but there was some follow-on guidance that just actually came out hot off the presses here in January. And so it has some additional follow-on information about if a balance of a participant who is no longer in the plan is under $1,000, it has a process for being able to essentially go through some steps and then send that money, sheet it to the state. So that's some new guidance to consider too, as it relates to missing participants. The other piece of this is this idea of a couple other things. One, forcing out money to a couple. You could either do the normal force out provider, and so that's one component for the under five. It used to be 5,000, and if you opted in with a different provision under secure, that's up to $7,000, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. But you can go from the 5,000 to the 7,000 if you opted in. So this is for small sums under 7,000 for participants who are no longer in your plan. You can send that money out. The last thing to keep in mind here is this concept called the auto portability network. So depending on who your record keeper is, you may be able to opt into this network of providers. Some of the record keepers are like TIAA, Fidelity, Vanguard. There's some others that Marco will keep me honest on, but they're in this network, but you have to opt into this, and you have to sign a different set of paperwork, and you have to vet this. I think Empower's in that as well. And then as your people go from one company to another, if they're in this network, then that's going to help you also keep track of your participants. So the reason why this kind of lost and found database is going to be important is it's all part of this bigger concept of helping keep track of your people, which ultimately is your job, but you can help them to also take some self-responsibility for keeping track of basically their own savings through this lost and found database as well. And you could run that on your people too.
Bonnie, with that whole kind of portability, just if you could forecast down the road, obviously the big guys, the big record keepers are involved, and you're covering Empower, Fidelity. You went down the list. Over time, I think I just don't know why all the record keepers wouldn't jump in. It obviously probably cuts out a third-party custodian. They're not going to be happy about this because they're out of business now. So maybe that's not the right business to be in at the moment. But if this happens and everybody's kind of moving around and your account just automatically follows you because every record keeper's in this portability network, do you see that everybody's going to join this, or is there like an exclusionary thing by the big record keeper saying, no, we're not going to let everybody in because we want this to be the big boys club? And what are you seeing develop on this with this portability network?
That's a great question. I think that so Retirement Clearinghouse is like the glue that's holding that together. And I think for them, they're the ones who are going to continue. I think they are the one who can continue to invite more people, and they can make more money the more of these folks who are joining. And so I think that it will continue to grow. I also think that I think it'll continue to grow. So I do think while some of the bigger firms might want to keep people out, I think that it will continue to grow because it's held together by Retirement Clearinghouse.
Okay, I'm just curious. Okay, we'll see.
I think that's a really good question.
Yeah.
And it'll be interesting to see what happens with the lost and found database, because it is a government-run website, and it will be interesting to see how well it will function long term. But the concept is very good. Okay, so we've covered the mandatory ones. I would say make sure that if that long-term part-time applies to you, I think that is the biggest action item. And when I say if it applies to you, it does apply. The question is just, do you already have eligibility provisions where it's not an issue? But I would check your plan documents. Then we get into the optional provisions. So again, these are the ones you don't have to do. But one thing I would just make sure is that, did you actually opt into one of these and you didn't even realize it? So I think that's a big thing to keep in mind. Another one that I would say that we have not touched on, but I'll put this as an in-between before we jump into the optionals, because it kind of goes along with the item 109 there, is the Roth catch-up. So I mentioned this just briefly earlier, but Roth catch-up initially got pushed back at the outset. It got a 2-year reprieve, and so we had a break under notice 2023-62. They said, hey, no one's ready for that Roth catch-up provision. We're going to push that back, and that's not going to start until the beginning of 26. Well, great news. As of the last month, we got proposed regulations from the IRS, and it is very clear it is starting the beginning of 2026. So I would say make sure, another action item is to make sure you are ready to comply with the Roth catch-up provision. And if you are not, you've got a year to get ready, but I would just make sure that that's something you're working on. And so then on to the optional provisions. We've really already talked about the higher catch-up contributions for like that super catch-up from 60 to 63. The next one I would mention is the student loan payments to count as elective deferrals. This is one that came, I think it was back in 2018 or 19. There was a private letter ruling related to Abbott Labs, and this was kind of all the rage of this idea of, hey, you could basically have, participants who can make their student loan payment, and then so they're making their student loan payment, and then the equivalent amount they can get the match into the retirement plan. And so that was memorialized in Secure 2.0. I think the interesting thing from my perspective has been the actual uptake of that. So Plan Sponsor Council of America did a survey on tons of these different provisions as part of their annual survey, this being their 67th annual survey, and only 2% of plan sponsors who responded to that survey have actually adopted this optional student loan matching provision. So I think that's pretty telling, that I think a lot of people are interested in it, but there is a lot of logistical things that are still being worked out. It is an optional provision. There was follow-up guidance in August of 2024, which is in the form of a proposed regulation. But I think a lot of people aren't willing to actually implement it yet, just given all of the logistical components, and that it impacts testing as well. So you really have to determine, is this the right fit for our plan? The next one is the penalty-free withdrawals for certain emergency expenses. So there's 2 emergency savings provisions under Secure 2.0. One of them was for $1,000 withdrawals, and the other is to create like this, I'm going to call it sidecar account for 2,500. What I would say is a lot of record keepers aren't even doing the 2,500. Most are doing the $1,000 withdrawals, and on the $1,000 withdrawals, the uptake in the $1,000 withdrawals, again, I'll refer to that same PSCA survey. The $1,000 ones, about 30% of plan sponsors have added that. Less than 1% are doing that 2,500 provision. So I think the $1,000 emergency savings, there's a lot of merit to that one. Again, these are all optional. The 2,500, I don't see much uptake in that at all. Another one that I'll just briefly mention is just this whole idea of the self-certification for hardship withdrawals, which you're seeing a lot more. We could probably do a whole discussion on that piece. I am all for the self-certification of hardships and other items like the student loans and that sort of thing, but with the caveat that you have to have internal procedures for how to do that. In other words, don't get documentation, review part of it, but then have self-certification. It's all or nothing when you decide to go down that route. All right, Marco, I know we're getting close to time, so you had a question on this one.
Yeah. Yeah, all right. It's a softball for you, Bonnie. So, on 127 here, emergency savings accounts, the 314 penalty-free withdrawals for victims of domestic abuse. And then you have this other one that I don't see, I don't think it's listed here, is the FEMA level natural disaster. So as we've been consulting with our clients for the past year on these, I want to say, I don't know the exact percentage, but it's really high, if not 100%. Everybody's just saying, hey, we want to put those into our plan. And the reason that they're saying that, at least from the clients that we have, is they don't want to be the plan when something like this happens and their participant comes to them and says, hey, I'm a victim of domestic abuse, or, God forbid, a natural disaster comes through FEMA level, and they can't get access to their funds. So everybody's just saying, we don't want to be that company. So they're for the most part, all the clients we're consulting with are electing these optional provisions. So here's my question. And let's take the FEMA level natural disaster one, right? Tornado, we're in Kansas, tornado comes through. I hate to use the word, but is there a pre-existing condition? And here's what I mean by that. You said something earlier that you can always miss an optional and then go back and elect it. But can you do that if like a tornado happens? Now everybody comes and says, hey, I heard from my friends that I can get access to some of my 401k, but the company either forgot, missed, chose not to, whichever, to elect the optional provision. Can they put it in place now? So that's question number one. And then I guess kind of the caveat to that is, if they do, then you're still talking a delay, right? Because it's got to get into place. So you want to have those things in place when something like that's happened. So I guess the question is, can you elect one of these things after the event happens when somebody comes to request it?
That's not a softball, and that you totally busted me on that. So that's spot on. So let's say we have folks in LA right now.
Yeah,
We
yeah,
can't now go.
better.
Yep,
Yeah.
we cannot go add the disaster relief one.
They
So
cannot.
your point is well taken. Or like domestic abuse, right? Let's say we have a small plan. We have a participant who comes and says, "Hey, I saw this on the news that you have this provision, but our plan didn't have it." I can't then go say, "Hey, participant A, B, C, yeah, I'll add it because now you've had this event." And it's a self-certified provision, but if the plan didn't have it, the plan didn't have it. So you're actually that's a really astute point. And I was wrong. You can't, you can always add them later, but if you think it is what the plan needs, you do need to add that now, because you can't go add it after the tornado hits or after the fire destroys the
Yeah.
whole
Good to
community.
know.
Yeah,
You said earlier that you can add it, and I wasn't trying to trap you on that. I was just trying to
that's a
say
good point.
I didn't know. I really didn't know. And LA is a perfect example. All those plans out there that this just became
Gosh.
available. Their advisors
Yep.
hopefully are out there talking to those plans. They didn't elect this. I mean, we have plans that are still going through the process of getting this on board. And you're telling me all those people now don't have access to their 401k because their plan didn't elect it.
That is
Wow.
the importance of
Interesting.
taking this
Okay.
seriously. You're spot
Okay.
on.
Okay.
It would not only be the delay of getting it done, but it's just that, you need to have the provision in place. So that actually is really important reason to take it seriously and do it now.
Okay. Good to know. Thank you. We'll bring that into our consulting. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a good point. I know we're coming up on time, and definitely if there's any other questions, let us know, or I can always hang on a little bit after too, or we can take follow-up questions. one of the things I will point out is there's a lot of provisions that for smaller businesses, I think there's a lot of things with starting plans, with expanding coverage. But one of those provisions, it can impact smaller plans, but also much larger plans too. And that's just this idea of grouping plans together through some concepts that have existed a long time, MEPs, or this concept of PEPs, pooled employer plans. So taking multiple plans, they could be of different size and shapes of companies, and pooling them together really to gain scale and efficiency. And I don't know, Marco, if you want to talk about that at all, but I think it is important for people to know there's opportunities. And I know Two West has done some work in that as well, where it really can just help employers to gain some different access they wouldn't otherwise have.
Yeah, I mean, overall, I'd say we've been kind of slow to adopt, because they are so new. I know that concept's been around for a long time with MEPs and things, but this concept of companies that are unrelated, non-industry related, coming together and jumping in the same plan together, still having control over their plan design, but having to use the same record keepers, the same advisors, the same funds, and things like that. We just haven't seen a lot of adoption. We've brought the concept to every one of our clients. Clients we serve are larger. I would say, our average, account has well over 100 employees. I think our average plan sponsor probably has, Andy's on the call, you could probably tell me, but it's probably somewhere between 300 and 500 employees. So the majority of our clients are subject to an audit. That is a big advantage. You would certainly drive your audit cost way down to virtually nothing versus writing the $5,000 to $20,000 check you write for an audit. That's a good thing. But here's my thing on PEPs. And it's kind of back the same thing that I was talking about earlier when I was talking about startups with auto enroll and auto escalate. I think the plan of the future is going to be jumping into PEPs. I just do. I think it's the easy button. Hey, you want to start up a 401k? How about you jump in this program over here? Because from the eyes of an advisor, we do a lot of work for our clients. We want to do a lot of work for our clients. We think we add a lot of value to our clients, and they're paying us to do that. Well, we drive down costs. We get them with the best record keepers. We get these plans set up. Well, the challenge is going to be when you bring on a small plan, it's hard to afford to do all that work because we don't really distinguish between $1 million plan and a $300 million plan. We do a lot of work for all of our clients. So you're seeing a lot of these smaller plans go into these pooled plan arrangements. And this is where I'm going with this. In the future, I think that's where your plans are going to be. I think your plans are going to be in PEPs because the small plans that are eventually going to be 20, 30, 40, 50, $100 million plans, that's how they're going to start. So while I don't see a lot of large plans today jumping into PEPs, I do think that if you fast forward 10 years, I think the same people on this call, I don't know what the percentage is going to be, but I bet the percentage is significantly higher than today. How many of them are going to be in some pooled plan arrangement with our other organizations? But it's something to take note of. We're bringing it to all of our clients to be aware of these pool plan arrangements, but they are growing in adoption. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think it will continue to grow.
Yeah.
Some people will always want a strong level of customization, but I think they will grow.
Yeah.
I know we were at the top of time.
Yep.
I know some folks want to make sure they get their certificate, which I know that Andy will put in your fiduciary files as a follow-on. And I know maybe, Marco, we got a question about materials, so maybe I'll let you take that.
Oh, absolutely. I would just say available after the call. If you just email myself or Andy or Marco at twowestadvisors.com, we'll make sure we can get this material to you. If we didn't already send it out, Andy, we probably already sent it out. But if it hasn't been sent to you, just ask and we can definitely get you that material out.
Awesome. Well, with that, thanks everyone for joining.